This is a Labyrinth segment. Before I begin, I should state that Knights of Awakening does not make any claims to trademark or copyrights of Lord of the Rings, Gandalf, Dungeons and Dragons, or anything else that may be mentioned in this show, nor does the Labyrinth, nor do I, Charles McBride, claim to own any of these characters or rights thereof. And with that said, our segment today, for this Labyrinth segment that you've come here and either downloaded or are listening to live, is Wizards. That's the Wizard War, you'd call it. The Wizard War. Gandalf versus Dungeons and Dragons. Now, why did I pick these two? Because it's pretty interesting. You know, D&D was inspired. Dungeons and Dragons, also known as D&D. And for those who don't know what it is, it's a game in which people take on the roles of other characters and use dice as a mechanic for resolution of scenarios and conflict. With that in mind, D&D was heavily inspired by Lord of the Rings. There's no denying it. The hobbits, halflings are in both. Dwarves and elves are both drawing their inspiration from Lord of the Rings, where Lord of the Rings drew its inspiration for the ideas from Norse philosophy and Norse history. D&D drew directly from Lord of the Rings for its designs for character concepts, to a degree. And the reason I'm pitting these two against each other is really to prove a point on path and practice within wizardry. It's to prove a point within the superiority of one over the other. But in no way does it take away from the fun of both. In fact, I'm a rabid Lord of the Rings fan. I'm already foaming at the mouth. I mean, what more do you want? But I'm also a rabid D&D player. It was my first role-playing game that I really got into that included dice and wasn't just some homebrewed kiddie bullshit. And it's really been the inspiration for a lot of the different things I've done in my path. The ideas behind it. But I came to a time and a point where this constrictive view of the wizard didn't fit my view, and I started asking myself, where the hell did my view come from? And I looked back, and wow, I think of a wizard as this guy charging in with a staff in one hand, a sword in the other, beating the crap out of people. That would be Gandalf. So the first thing we should do is look at magic in both settings before we go laying down the ground rules for this. Before this knockdown slugfest occurs, we have to understand that magic is handled differently in both settings. Ceremony is still a big factor, just as it is in the real world. Can be a factor, not necessarily a requirement. We'll get into that also. But in Dungeons and Dragons, magic doesn't happen without quite a bit of prep work. You don't learn to exert your will on the world around you directly, and if you do, it's a very, very, very limited amount. Most of what you do is prep work. The wizard in Dungeons and Dragons spends hours in books. They have to have an incredibly high intelligence score. Basically, they're the freaking geniuses of the D&D world, and they apply that. They are the scientists of the Dungeons and Dragons universe. And in Lord of the Rings, we see 2 wizards total. I mean, that we really see within the story, 2 wizards total. And within that, those 2 wizards do quite a bit. But the magic has limitations, and that's really, I guess, what I'm hinting at, is that D&D has a system in which this time invested grants these phantasmic, cosmic powers beyond belief. And Lord of the Rings has some pretty impressive stuff too, but no one ever opens up a pocket dimension in Lord of the Rings. No one ever hurls a fireball from the tip of a wand or staff. It has to be believed that in the history of the Lord of the Rings, in the past, this was possible, but for some reason it becomes limited throughout time. That in mind, the differences between these two, while existent, are subtle in that respect. So we have to really start breaking down the abilities. And I say Gandalf versus D&D. I could say Lord of the Rings versus D&D. Or I could say, the world of Lord of the Rings versus the Forgotten Realms of Dungeons and Dragons. But I use Gandalf because Gandalf is the prime and easily accessible example. So, we're gonna take a look, since we've got this laid down here. In Dungeons and Dragons, at the higher end of the spectrum, wizards become unstoppable. Hell, at the lower end of the spectrum, they start to do things in a way that's different. And they're not really ever that much more effective than anyone else. It's just that everything is so epic in level and scale and ability, whereas Lord of the Rings tried to stay a little bit down to earth. With that in mind, the application, the principle behind it's the same. And therefore, we can draw a comparison. Let's start with the early levels. Okay, the early levels of Dungeons and Dragons I'm listing as levels 1 through 7. And I would say that looking at Gandalf and as he progresses, that would be anywhere from The Hobbit to the first book. And what do we have here that's different? Well, the first thing that's different is that the D&D wizard begins with the ability to summon a familiar. You could say that Gandalf begins with a very similar ability, but we'll get into a little bit of that later. He begins more with animal communication abilities. With that in mind, the first level wizard begins with a spell from the first school and 3 from the zero school. The zero school is stuff so simple that your 4-year-old should be able to cast it given a little bit of time and effort. Well, maybe not that simple, but it's nothing really impressive. It has the amount of damage of someone jabbing your hand with a butter knife at best. Probably not even that good against armor. Maybe the equivalent of lighting a candle with magic. And at the first level, Gandalf doesn't fare much better. He has the ability that we see initially that he's wise and manipulative and cunning. We don't get to see very much magic in the first book. We do get to see more as time progresses. Taking all the way up to level 7 for Dungeons and Dragons in this comparison. Just going up to level 7 so that we can wrap this out because it's accumulative. They get up to where they have 1 4th level spell. And to give you an example of a 4th level spell, this really gives you an idea of how they deal with problems. They have magic circles against chaos or evil or good or what have you. They have the ability to create phantom horses or sleet storms or even divine or arcane sight, the ability to see auras. From the point of view of damage output, which is really the easiest thing to really look at, they begin to throw friggin' fireballs. Impressive, yes, but the Dungeons and Dragons wizard has, at that level, still the lowest hit point pool. So that means they can't take a punch on the cheek. Gandalf, on the other hand, has been knocked from one side of Middle-earth to the other at level 7 and survived it. To give you an example of the approaches taken by these two character groups. In Lord of the Rings, when presented with a Balrog, Gandalf begins to wield his magic. And his magic has the following effects. He is able to crumble the bridge underneath him. Easily, a level 7 wizard should be able to do this. He is able to protect himself from the fire and the whip. Easily, a level 7 wizard from D&D should be on par with this. Okay? And when pulled down into the pit, he takes sword in hand and begins hacking away at his foe with the sword, beating on him with the staff, driving it into him. Okay? On the way down of this 1,000 or 10,000 foot fall. D&D wizards don't do that. A D&D wizard might cast spells. At that phase, a D&D wizard would have a lot more powerful spells. But at no point would the D&D wizard ever engage in close combat. At no point would they ever charge headfirst into battle and be just hacking away at their foe with the weapon of choice. It's not what D&D wizards do. It's not part of their makeup. And for those that are into the newer versions of D&D, I'm using 3.5 edition as my reference point because it's a reference point I'm familiar with. A D&D wizard would probably use some form of ice spell at that point and try to levitate themselves to safety. And if they had those spells prepared, they would be able to do it. Which I guess brings us to the next point. Gandalf's magic is completely spontaneous. You could call him a sorcerer by D&D standards, but there ain't never been a sorcerer who wields a sword like that. His magic is spontaneous and manipulatable. It can be altered towards whatever he really needs it to do. And if what he needs it to do is allow him to drive his friggin' sword all the way down the throat of a Balrog, well, then that's what it's gonna do for him. The difference here is plain. And a lot of people would say it's unfair to compare Gandalf to a Dungeons & Dragons wizard, especially at the early levels. Because Gandalf is more of a fighter, and a lot of people will make the statement that he's a fighter-wizard hybrid. And I could see that, except that he's the only real example of wizardry we have, and we never see any comparison, any difference between him and other wizards in that respect. They all pretty much do it the same way Gandalf does, in that they handle things head on. So, what about distance? You know, D&D wizards are going to always have that distance factor. Well, Gandalf has some distance ability. We really don't get to see it so much in the first movie, though. We'd have to almost believe that it's after he has progressed past this threshold of not the initiate level, because he's well past that when we first see him, but the threshold between low and mid-level ability. Now, this is where I start to look at the practicality of these two ideas as looking at this and molding your path around either one. Gandalf's path is one of physicality and mysticality. Even if mysticality isn't in a word, I'm going to coin it here today. His path is one more of the warrior and the wizard built upon each other. He doesn't deny his physical body and its uses. He uses his physical body. It is a tool. It is the weapon of choice at the right moment for its use. Whereas his mind is a weapon of choice at the right moment of its use. Likewise, Gandalf, to continue this comparison, is an expert in explosives, as we see that his use of fireworks early on. And he's an expert in combat, tactics, tactical analysis, and just fighting. I mean, he does more damage than anyone else on his team, and the only spells we see are a defensive barrier and crumbling a rock bridge. Simple third level D&D spells that this high level wizard just pulls out of nowhere. Doesn't have to prepare them. He doesn't sit down for 4 hours. You know, I gotta do my circle and I gotta do this, that, and the other. And I'm not saying that's not an applicable or even practical way of doing mysticism. I'm saying that this is just where the comparison starts. We move forward. We move into the later levels, what I call the mid-levels, and this is after Gandalf's return. This is where the first point comes up, is the fact that he does return. At no point in Dungeons & Dragons does a wizard gain the ability to self-resurrect. At no point do they come back simply because they've left something undone. Gandalf, on the other hand, is a crotchety old bastard you can't kill, no matter how hard you try. And you can throw him down in the pits of hell with a Balrog, and he will kill said Balrog on the mountaintop and come back, because his task is not yet complete. Holy hell! That's like getting run over by a car, and you're like, man, I gotta get up, I left the stove on. I mean, this dude is unstoppable, and this is where they start to differentiate, and really a lot of this difference is on the level of power available to the D&D wizard, but it's also in how they handle tasks. Gandalf is very hands-on, very upfront in dealing with problems as they come, very much in the middle of things. And in the second book, which we'll be also covering in this breakdown, levels 8 through 14 for a D&D wizard, in the second book, he starts to shine much, much brighter. At one point, blinding his fellows. He becomes Gandalf the White. What kind of differences are there between their mysticisms? What is the difference in the way they handle being mystic? Well, Gandalf handles being mystic at these levels in how he acts and how he thinks. And really his magic is there to be magic against other magic. It's really there to help work with the mind. It's not so much big flashy balls of fire. The D&D wizard, on the other hand, gains numerous spells, vast and encompassing. The ability to do things that just have no right making it into anything. And I'm going to go to their level 6 spells for my comparison, because they get a bunch of those. And give you an idea what the D&D wizard picks up. The ability to break enchantment, which is kind of nice. And I would give this comparison with Gandalf. You know, how does the D&D wizard break an enchantment? Well, first he sits for 4 hours, drawing circles and doing chants and, scracking in runes into trees and dancing the hokey pokey and turning himself around. And then he takes, an eye of newt, a pinch of bat dung, and a handful of sand, mixes it together, and it's now a spell component that is going to disappear when he uses it. Sounds like some utter bullshit to me, but we'll get into the real world part of this in a minute. He takes this, and then by casting this towards a person, it will break their enchantment, or perhaps another combination of things will allow him to create a cloud that will kill all foes nearby that are of a lesser ability than him. Or perhaps he'll use a planar binding where he can trap extra-dimensional creatures, or a wall of stone. I will give him this at that point. The wizard starts to become more amazing than Gandalf, more raw powerful. How does Gandalf handle, breaking an enchantment? Well, he has a very simple method. It's called whacking him with a stick. That's right, he takes his staff and he beats people upside the head until they come to their senses. We'll get into the practical applications of Dungeons and Dragons as a spellcrafting system at the end of this part rather. And, we'll get into that versus Lord of the Rings view of spellcraft and its practicality. And then I'll even get into where the rules break and collide. Because that's really what this is about today. It's not really to say that one is better than the other. I favor Gandalf, obviously, honestly. But, in D&D, I've played wizards, not exclusively, but frequently. Because they kinda are in the area I like to dabble in mentally. And it gives me an idea to really kinda, go and run with that idea. Other abilities they may gain would be things like polymorph spells, where they can change subjects into a harmless animal. Enchantment spells, the ability to dominate a person. Again, some of this sounds like it was taken right out of Lord of the Rings. And some of it was taken right out of Lord of the Rings, like a feeble mind spell, the ability to drop a person's intelligence to that of a child, or a mind fog, or a conjuration to summon a monster, or an illusion to cause dreams, or to get into someone's dreams. A lot of these things really sound familiar, but the difference is being that Dungeons and Dragons really kind of borrowed from this and then upped it one step at a time, because you remember the old D&D wasn't quite this power mad. The abilities that a wizard gained were subtle. But then again, a wizard wasn't a toothpick, which is where we get into the next part of the comparison with these two. Upon returning from the great beyond, or hitting level 14, whichever came first, Gandalf comes back a badass. He has, as the TV Trope website put it, taken a level in badass. He didn't just take a level in badass, he took 5 levels in badass. He took a whole separate character class in badass. So I guess we could say that this is a comparison between a D&D wizard and a badass wizard. And what we've got now is a guy who, when presented with the 3 most dangerous warriors in all of the world, okay? Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn. They throw their weapons at him. What's he do? He smacks their weapons through the air with his staff, shattering them. Because he's a badass. That's not really very mystical mumbo-jumbo. He doesn't go, "Fabba-da-boosh," and make a wall appear. He doesn't wave his hand and the weapons fly from their hands. He doesn't create a wall of wind to stop them or a wall of brick. He just breaks them in half with his friggin' staff. Because he's a badass. So I guess the comparisons went from Gandalf versus Dungeons and Dragons wizards to badass wizards versus Dungeons and Dragons wizards. And the Dungeons and Dragons wizard at this phase has become frail. Gandalf gets cut, hit, beat, just knocked around left and right, and he holds up better than everyone else. He goes and he fights Sauron. He goes over and he's like, yep, time for us to settle what started last time. And I guess I gotta back the train up. For long distance, fighting is mental combat. Fighting is a battle of wills. It has a physical repercussion, which is very realistic in comparison to frickin' throwing balls of fire. Balls of fire are big and flashy, and it makes people feel as if though the world is bigger and more impressive, when in the reality it's just less real and less realistic, therefore harder to get into, I think. Anyway, he goes and he's like, what we started before ends now. And he beats the living daylights. Now, I think I'm ahead of myself. I think I'm into the third book already. So before I get into the third book, let's look at what spells Gandalf uses. When approached with an army, a D&D wizard would throw a big frickin' fireball, or a storm of ice, or a cloud of death, or, a rain of hamsters, or something. Something big and raw, When presented with an army, what does Gandalf do? He rides out first to make sure that he can get reinforcements. He collects those reinforcements using diplomacy, wisdom, intelligence, and effect. He applies effort to create effect. Rides back with his army, and he raises his staff to the sky, and as the light gleams off the crystal of his staff, it mystically bends and becomes stronger. This sounds pretty realistic. I've done some weather magic in my time, and I'll tell you this. Altering the weather to get a really bright and sunny day is not that freaking hard to do. Better yet, knowing when the bright and sunny day is going to be and showing up right at that time to aim your freaking crystal in the way of it is even easier to do. So with that in mind, one way or the other, Gandalf shows up and blinds the enemy hordes with the one thing they are the weakest to, light. Now, how would a D&D wizard handle it? A volcano would frickin' open up and start spewing lava on them or something like that. Something very unrealistic, very flashy, and very much keeping that wizard at a distance, away from the fighting, away from the action. Instead, this blinding light doesn't kill his enemies, just makes it easier for him to get closer to him so he can start hacking them with a sword and beating them with a stick. Because he's a badass wizard. But there is some safety in distance. There is some safety in being able to put some distance between you and an enemy. That's why Gandalf allies himself with an elf who fires arrows up close, and a dwarf who fights with a friggin' battle axe, and a man who's crazy enough to jump into a horde of enemies to defend a castle bridge. That's why Gandalf, no, that doesn't make any sense. What I mean to say is that Gandalf is very, very much, he knows how to keep his distance. That's why he only charges headfirst into the middle of battle. What I really mean to say is that it's a very different kind of wizard we're looking at here. Gone is the frail stereotype, which has been created by the Dungeons and Dragons games. Gone is this idea of the man stays back out of the fight, is old and feeble and decrepit. I have never met people that are in that bad of shape. Most of the old people I know would kick your ass. I've not met someone who, in the middle of a war, would be there, I can't rush in and do something. No, most of the old people I know would be frickin' tying steak knives to their walking sticks and stabbing people. Which is kind of the point I get to. It's a different view of age, it's a different view of experience that we're looking at. It's a totally different kind of wizard. And when someone says wizard, they conjure up this elementary image in their mind of this dude in this pointy hat. They conjure up the image of Gandalf. Wow, they can't conjure up the image of Gandalf, and then they turn him into a D&D wizard. They turn him into this weak, ineffectual, I can't go into that battle, I'll stand out to the side and fire my spells. The difference between Gandalf and the D&D wizard is Gandalf would be like the ultimate firearms master who weighs 110 pounds and has every known major muscle disease. I mean, they're great at a distance, but up close they get their ass handed to them. Gandalf, instead, is closer to being more like the 800-pound gorilla you just pissed off. You're certain it's wise when you look into its eyes. You can see the intelligence and the depth as it rips your arms from your body. That's Gandalf. Gandalf's the 800-pound gorilla who just happens to throw spells once in a while. Okay? That's the wizard that I know. That's my idea of what a wizard is and should be. But we're going to go further, because we've yet to get to the last levels, okay? The battle is not yet complete. Into the third book. And it's been a while since I read these books, but I know that several battles happen between point A and point B. And I remember a good bit of it. I remember there's another possession that occurs. But by the time we hit the third book, we're hitting level 20 now for Dungeons & Dragons. And level 20 in terms of raw power, raw manipulative ability of the world around them, the D&D wizard is the king. Now, on the other side of that, throughout all of this, they can only use their spells so many times a day, which is kind of different because Gandalf appears to not have a limit to what he can do with his magical ability, but his magical ability seems to be hitting people in the nuts with a stick. So maybe it's just a difference in the way the mechanics of, opening up a trans-dimensional rift in time and space are, and hitting people in the nuts with a stick. But it seems to me like the value of opening up that hole in time and space would be far inferior to that golf club-like swing that's mastered by Gandalf. We hit level 20. We've got to get into some of the high-level power the D&D wizards have. They can summon the highest level of monsters available. They can summon things that are extra-planar to have fight on their side. They can teleport any creature to any designated spot that they've designated beforehand. They can see the future, which Gandalf can too, to a degree. But he was doing that back at level 7, which is why all of this is happening. They can conjure illusions that can kill. They can project themselves astrally, which I would like to say that when you look at some of the things in Lord of the Rings, you could almost make a good argument for Gandalf doing that. On the high level ability, they gain the ability to have a swarm of meteors impact a target. And the equivalent of that damage is about the equivalent of having 3 broadswords hit you per so many levels of the wizard. I really have to take a look at that spell to get you a little bit better reference. And as I look at it now, it's they're listing this sucker with trails of sparks and fire and flame, and they have to make a range-based touch attack, which what that means for all those who aren't know, it's the equivalent of being able to touch the person but using your mind in place of your hand, but it's just as difficult, so it relies on your reflexes you build up mentally. Yeah, they're really only doing that damage. That it's about the equivalent of 3 broadswords. The broadsword's 2d6. Talking big fucking sword. It's 2d6, and they're doing 3 times that damage. So they're doing about the equivalent of 3 broadswords hitting a target. Okay, 40-foot radius. Okay, that's great. They can do that, 4, maybe 5, 6 times at most a day. Gandalf is a 40-foot radius of death. Gandalf is a 40-foot spinning radius, okay, of pure hell and destruction. He is not shooting fire out of his ass by this point. He is not blasting lasers out of his eyes. He is spinning and hacking and hitting and creating flashes of light. He is doing these things, and he is tearing through at a rate that is unimaginable. While everyone else is there. I've killed 10, I've killed 20, I've killed 100. Gandalf's there. I'm working on 1,055. They never list his kill count. His kill count is so high it becomes unlisted. The only thing we know for certain is that while Gandalf is on the field, while Gandalf is in the battle, it's over for what he's going up against. Nothing out there is the equivalent to Gandalf. Why? Because he's the friggin' uber wizard. But he is not throwing spells with a limited amount. He's not there because he's out of stamina. He's there charging boldly and bravely into battle, striking down his foes one after the other. And he can do this all goddamn day. Where the D&D wizard has a limit. They can only do this for so often. And this is where the paradigm begins. It's the paradigm of the well-rounded, capable, true intellectual versus the one who gains knowledge and power from knowledge, but only that. They gain no strength. They gain no constitution. And I don't mean just the character stats. I mean the ideal of strength, the ideal of constitution. They gain no endurance to difficulty. They gain no ability to overcome challenge. They are the easy path that is hard to take because they are still frail. When you look at the characters at these levels, you strip them of all the fantastic gear that the DM will either throw to his players or let them achieve in minuscule amounts. You put them at just what they are, and what you have is the more easily killed character. You have the character that can die by a single hit or a single mistake. Their own spells can kill them. Whereas Gandalf is very much physically tough. Gandalf is very much this force of will in and of himself. Gandalf is coming at you to do what he's going to do. And that moves us really into the heart of this topic. That moves us into the heart of this analysis, and that's looking at these things as a path. And I know I've went on 30 minutes, and wow, that's a long time for a Labyrinth segment. Normally, I don't really push these things that long, but this is one gives you a lot to think about. And it's the applicability of path is what this is all pertaining to. When you look at these two sets of characters, which one of these is more real for you? Which one of these can you make more real in your life? From the Gandalf point of view, you can meditate to gain spiritual awareness and some ability to alter the world around you through altering your focus. You can gain the ability to alter chance and probability to be on your side, and you can become a badass, kick-ass fighter. And for the older people out there that say, well, Gandalf was a fictional character, and I'm an old person and I can't kick ass, learn to fight with your walking stick. Learn to kick ass with that. Because that's what he did. I mean, come on. For the younger people out there, you know what? We have years to become this good. So we should start now, so that we get it done in time. What I'm saying is, the applicability is a question of the strong, physically able, embodied. He's almost like a warrior monk wizard. Versus very intellectually heightened. Now see, now I'm going to talk D&D up on this. We're talking about the supreme intelligence. We're talking about the specialist of intellect. Now for this, what you're looking at is someone who has become an expert on physics and metaphysics. You're looking at someone who has neglected the study of all other art forms to this art. And in looking at that, they gain a proficiency well above what we might achieve, to a degree, in the other art. What happens really is that you can only become so intelligent and so mentally focused when you're channeling this stuff through the body. There's a stop break. And what this really means is that if you were to break this down into stages of early, middle, and late in development, in the early phases, the Gandalfian type wizard archetype will be stronger. At the middle phases, they will actually be weaker because that vast amount of intellect allows that person to prepare so much more. I can tell you as someone who has a decent intellect that if you were going to tell me tomorrow we enter a conflict, I'm going to kill you. And the reason I can say that with confidence, if I know for certain it's going to happen, I'm going to freaking call the cops and send them to get you. No. That would be my first option. And I'm not suggesting anyone hurt anyone. But my point is, if it was just a straight up live or die contest and all I had were the things inside my house, I could bend my capable brain to doing some incredible devastation. I think in the room I'm in alone, I have sufficient equipment to blow this house off the face of the planet. I'm not even in my kitchen yet. If I go into my kitchen, the level of death and destruction I could rank on my home and the surrounding areas would be untold. Because there'd be no one left to tell about it. By the time I had hit the bathroom compiling these chemicals and this knowledge that I've gained, wipe out half the city block. Why? Because I've got a moderately high level of intelligence. And that's where the D&D wizard starts to kind of pull ahead. They can use this ability to allow them to function better in society. They can use their knowledge, though they lack the diplomacy. They lack the charisma. They lack the ability to bring people together, which is a key point of the Gandalf archetype. Even though they lack those things, they have the intelligence to make a lot of that stuff work for them, and they have the intelligence to become quite dangerous and quite powerful. And from a mystical standpoint, that pure honed focus on both intellect and power within metaphysics is going to make them a little bit ahead. And we move into the late game. And the late game's where it gets interesting. What I mean by that is when we move into the later levels in life, when you've reached the point where the body is now functioning but starting to grow a little weaker, that little bit of weakness equates to a really big set of problems. To give you an example, one who focuses on pure intellect will not be able to run, will not be able to fight, will not be able to move quick enough to make use of that raw intellectual power. Where this balanced point between the mind, the body, the spirit, between diplomacy, strength, and martial capability gives that person an edge. Are they as strong in mysticism? No, but in mysticism I've yet to see anyone in the late game, as I call it, in the later part of their training and their years of experience, throw a fireball or do anything really so impressive as to make them that superior to those who go the middle path in this. And the path I speak of, in a sense, is the path of balance. It's the path of harmony. It's the path of going into this with a rational mind, with reasonable expectations, and to make yourself the best that you can be in the areas that you're going into, and to really have a diverse portfolio of skills. Let's compare then how their abilities translate into real life techniques. The D&D wizard, by their very nature, is going to have to rely solely on firearms, solely on projectile weaponry, which is fair. It's fair, but you can't always have a firearm on you, and you can't even always keep a throwing knife. From a combat standpoint, the Gandalf-style wizard is superior because they always have the abilities on hand. Not necessarily more deadly, but I have yet to walk into a shopping mall and forget my hands. And in fact, I've hardly ever left my feet behind. My knees and elbows tend to go with me wherever I go. And if I have any aches and pains, I bring my walking stick to help me walk. And funnily enough, it's right there if I need to exercise someone. Which gets us into the next part, which is their spiritual techniques. From a spiritual standpoint, the D&D wizard has a really effective method of mysticism, which is repetition. Repetition and memorization to cause an effect through a trigger in the mind. Awesome ability. Awesome. That is one of the best methods for learning how to create alteration within the world. It is bar none the simplest to explain. It's bar none one of the easiest to go in with. Be that as it is, with all that it is, their abilities lack a certain bit of usability. You don't always have it on hand. Given a situation where someone is possessed, the D&D wizard will have to take one whole day and prepare themselves. And someone basing their metaphysics on this, and D&D was based on early Crowley works, so a lot of it, the ceremonial methods are very similar to Thelmatic magics. The idea. They never really present the details, they present the idea. They just tell you, you're going to be doing this, and they don't give you the details of it. So one who starts to expand upon those details is going to be able to do an exorcism through the memorization and all that. It's going to take about a day. The Gandalf one will generate a surge of power internally to push a demon out. And then failing that, we take a firm grasp on our walking stick and beat him upside the friggin' head, because you know what, I bet you the demon will get out of there. And I don't get called on for exorcisms very much. I follow that Gandalfian mentality, I guess you could say, and rarely anyone ever asks me to exorcise them. In fact, usually when I start swinging my walking stick at them, they tend to run so as to not be exercised. I guess in that respect, they get more exercise than they planned on. So, the applicability of the ability to channel and hone energy at will is far more useful and beneficial than pre-planned abilities, pre-planned executions of energy. Years ago, I tried to sit down and think of 5 spells I'd want to prepare on hand for every day. Everyday use, something that I always have ready. and then try to go that D&D route as a wizard. And I couldn't do it. I determined that the ability to fight with my staff and sword, the ability to fight with my hands, my elbows, my knees, and the ability to summon and conjure, focus, the ability to alter through sheer psychic willpower was far more beneficial in my day-to-day life than having these prepared things that I probably wouldn't use most days, and that are going to run out of power, because no matter how long you think your little ceremony lasts, it probably doesn't have much power beyond the first couple days. Its influence might, but if you don't finalize and execute it, the buildup goes away. So looking at this, the comparison is the bookworm, then. The D&D wizard, in reality, is the bookworm without any backing, without any strength, without any fortitude. They may actually run out of air getting on to the bus. They are going to be weakened in comparison. Versus the Gandalf philosophy, which is more in line with Odin, which I guess brings us up to the last part of this, which is the difference between these archetypes. Gandalf is an archetype of Odin, where the D&D wizard is an archetype of Gandalf, and what you have is you have an aspect of Odin, which is the mystic, the battle mystic, the powerful father figure, his mighty fighting staff in one hand, his spear, walking through the forest, wearing his hat and his traveler's cloak, looking for problems with which he might test his mighty skill. Versus the incarnation of that, which is Gandalf, the wise and sagely man walking through the forest with his staff, seeing how he might lend his skill to the aid of others. Still the wanderer, still very powerful. Then the D&D iteration becomes the incredibly intelligent, highly intellectual person walking through the forest, hoping to not piss off anything that might kill them, because they don't have a spell ready to deal with it. The difference in archetypes is clear. D&D was a decent game, and the ideas within it are fun and good to play with, and you get a lot of ideas for things you can do with mysticism, with psychic energy. It's not a bad route to go in terms of pulling ideas from, but building your path around it, using this piece of fiction to help you build your mysticism, using it as the groundwork would be terrible. Your mysticism will suffer and your physical world will go to shit. Using the principles that Gandalf put forward, the ideas and the concepts, this look at how to view the world, this way of dealing with things, being the diplomat who arranges alliances, being the friend and the confidant to the people around you, being the strong, wise, and intelligent figure, but also powerful, quick to anger, and capable of holding your own, makes you more than a match for most challenges in this world, makes you the better wizard, the better concept of the wizard, and I guess then, in my view, it is obvious. Gandalf is the superior wizard concept. He is the basis for the idea of wizardry. He is not the old crippled intellect. He is the strong power that age and wisdom and strength come together to. He is the better ideal of the wizard. But there's still a lot to gain from that little game with dice. There's still a lot to gain in it, and it's still a fun game. And don't let this put you off from playing it. In fact, if anything, I think everyone should play it at least once. Kind of get into it, play a character for a little while, get a feel for living a different life, and then use that to see what you want to change in your own life. See what it was in your character's world that you really want in your life that you're missing. It's a powerful tool. It's a fun game. It's a terrible, terrible path to go down. And this has been a Labyrinth segment.